Thank you all for joining us. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Nance, and I'm an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I'm speaking to you today from Denver, and I'll be chairing today's internal PSL class series on climate solutions beyond capitalism. We're very excited to begin this class series today with the first class titled The Problem We Face. This class will cover the various ways that the climate crisis is unfolding globally, what it means for life on Earth, and how feedback loops will continue to speed up the unraveling if no comprehensive action is taken. I want to encourage everyone in this class today to join the full series of classes. It is critically important that all comrades are able to explain in plain language what is going on with the environment and climate change, and why specifically the socialist reorganization of society is ultimately needed to save humanity. Can we go to the next slide? My bad, that was it. Let's go to the next one. Classes, great. So the upcoming classes are listed here. This one today is The Problem We Face, and next Sunday, February 14th, at the same time, we'll be going over class number 2, Real Solutions to the Crisis, and then February 21st, we'll be going over class number 3, titled How Capitalism is a Barrier, and February 28th, we'll be going over the last class and 4th class, Socialism for Our Survival. We want all comrades here to talk about the topics and of these classes with others in their units or in their branch. Tell other comrades what you learned, encourage them to talk and join in the fight against the destruction of our environment and in our communities. This class series will be led by Tina Landis, author of the PSL book titled Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism. She is a founding member of the PSL, works in air quality and protection and climate protection, and holds a certificate in sustainable management from the University of California, Berkeley. She writes on environmental and climate issues for Liberation News and is a frequent commentator on Sputnik News, By Any Means Necessary, and Political Misfits. You can purchase the book online. We will put the link into the chat now for those who need it. We highly encourage that all comrades get and study the book. However, this isn't required to attend the class. If your local branch has not already held a branch-wide study of the book or a public event around it, it is highly encouraged. And if you would like to arrange for the author to join a local meeting about the book, please let your point of contact for the national department know, and we can arrange that. So before we begin this class, I'm just going to say a few things. Firstly, about Denver. All comrades know that we are in a fierce battle to defend our comrades in the movement as a whole in Denver, Colorado. Make sure that you have visited denverdefense.org and have watched a short documentary available there, which gives background about the struggle. If you have more questions about the Denver struggle, please contact your local leadership. And secondly, I want to make a pitch for all comrades to make sure you're keeping up with all party media. LiberationNews.org has expanded greatly in the past year with content and analysis coming out on a daily basis. It's critical that comrades regularly read the articles posted onto the website. Additionally, please keep up to date with liberationschool.org and our women's magazine, Breaking the Chains, at breakingthechangemag.org, and on social media until the next issue is physically released. Additionally, PSL members are hosts and regular speakers on podcasts, the Socialist Program with Brian Becker and the media group Breakthrough News. Both of these programs are putting out extremely important analysis that all comrades will benefit from. And lastly, before we start, I want to mention that we will be having an exciting lineup of classes coming out organized by the national leadership. In addition to this class, we'll have a public class titled Black Struggle is Class Struggle in the 3rd week of February. There's only 100 spots available for the class, so be sure that you sign up as soon as possible. And if you have any questions about this class, please contact your local leadership. In March, we will also be hosting 2 classes, a class about the roots of fascism and how to fight it, as well as a class about Marxist feminism. More information will be announced about these classes soon. And now, with all that said, I want to go ahead and turn the floor over to our presenter, Tina. She will give a presentation, after which we will have some time for Q&A. We want to make sure that we have a lot of participation from all of the attendees. So please put any questions and comments into the chat, and we will get to the ones that Tina can answer. And we will get to the ones that we can go over considering time. And the more questions and the comments we get, the better. Okay, welcome Tina. Next slide.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all the comments for joining today. I really wish we could be in person and I could meet you all, but hopefully once we're back to having public events, I can do a national book tour and be with you in person. So the objective of this class series is to provide a basic understanding of the issue of climate change so that we can better engage with the working class and inspire people to fight for real climate action. I know personally, and I've seen it with my friends and comrades, that despair and grief at what we're facing, at what we are losing, can be overwhelming, and hopelessness can take over, which has a demobilizing and demoralizing effect about this issue. Only when I really started studying and researching the issue more was I able to find hope. As revolutionary socialists, it's our duty to show our class that there is hope, that there are very concrete and simple solutions that can be achieved by humanity, and that the only thing holding us back is the capitalist system that puts the profits before the continuity of life itself. So that is the objective of this class series, to share the facts about what we are facing and the concrete solutions that exist, to give us the tools to inspire the masses into struggle and to shift the demands of the climate movement to the left, to call out capitalism as the culprit and socialism as the solution. Next slide. The mainstream media, I'm sorry, next one, I missed that one. The mainstream media ignores the solutions. 98% of articles focus solely on the problem. Just 6 corporations own all the mainstream media in the US. So even when articles do touch on solutions, the narrative stays well within what is achievable under capitalism's requirement of profits. It's also about clickbaiting. So-called disaster porn gets a higher number of views than stories about discoveries of ecological solutions or other countries implementing sustainable practices. Growing numbers of people are concerned about climate change, but only 5% of Americans feel it can be solved. This serves to demoralize and diffuse any significant struggle on climate action. If people aren't aware that there's hope for our survival, they won't demand action. Next slide. So what's causing climate disruption? All the Earth's systems work synergistically to create optimal conditions for life. The Earth is an intelligent system that works collectively to maintain a balance for the survival of the whole. But capitalist development has created a major imbalance to that system in a very short time period, and the Earth is struggling to rebalance. Next slide. The slow evolution of this system cannot adapt quickly enough to stem mass extinctions without our help. But the Earth itself will recover eventually, like it has in the past. For instance, 99% of species were wiped out after an asteroid struck the Yucatan 65 million years ago, but an abundance of new species reemerged over a long period of time. Climate change is already in motion, and we will need to adapt. Some of the repercussions can't be undone, but we can greatly stem the effects if we act quickly and with a global effort. Studies show that restoration of forests, wetlands, and grasslands, and a shift to regenerative agriculture can cool the climate in just decades, which I'll go into more in the next class. But I wanted to say this now so that there's some hope. Next slide. Since the Industrial Revolution that ended around 1840, capitalist development has created a major increase in greenhouse gas levels at a rate of change much faster than prior changes, as you can see in the timeline. If you're interested, you can view the entire graphic at the link on the screen there, and maybe Andrew could put it in the chat. But the timeline extends the whole way back to the last ice age and shows very clearly how climatic changes previously happened very slowly. Next slide. So what are the different greenhouse gases that are human caused and how are they impacting the atmosphere? The GHGs include CO2, nitrous oxide, methane, fluorinated gases, and black carbon, which is not shown in this slide. CO2 remains in the atmosphere for 100 to 150 years. So we're still feeling the effects of CO2 that was emitted in the late 1800s. And what we emit today potentially will still be impacting us for more than a century. Next slide. Each greenhouse gas has a different lifespan in the atmosphere and different warming potential. Methane comes mainly from natural gas production, industrial livestock production, and landfills, and stays in the atmosphere for 12 years, and has up to 36 times the warming capacity of CO2. Nitrous oxide comes mainly from industrial fertilizers, fossil fuel combustion, and biomass combustion, and stays in the atmosphere for 121 years, and has up to 298 times the warming capacity of CO2. Black carbon, which is also known as soot, comes from fossil fuel production or fossil fuel combustion, wood burning, and wildfires, and stays in the atmosphere for about 10 years and has 900 times the capacity to warm the atmosphere than CO2. Fluorinated gases, as you can see, are a major problem. They're a refrigerant and have an extremely high warming capacity at over 23,000 times that of CO2, and some stay in the atmosphere for thousands of years. Some of you may remember the ozone hole. These gases replaced the ozone depleting substances that were banned globally under the Montreal Protocol in 1987. But as you can see, it created a new problem. As the world warms and more people are using air conditioning around the globe, more of these gases inevitably leak into the atmosphere and add warming. There are new refrigerant gases that have a much lower warming capacity that are beginning to be utilized. And a recent amendment to the Montreal Protocol will phase out the use and production of the worst of these gases. But without proper disposal of all the existing equipment that contains these gases, they will eventually leak into the atmosphere when they reach the landfill. Under socialism, of course, this could easily be solved in an organized replacement and disposal program. Next slide. As of today, there are 415 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. 350 is considered the level needed for a stable climate. And as you can see in the slide, the rise of CO2 corresponds directly to the rise in temperatures. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Are there any questions that relate to anything I talked about so far? Andrew, you can let me know.
Yeah, we have one in the chat that I believe was asked during slide 11. It says, does this mean that burning firewood is worse for the environment, is worse for the atmosphere than fossil fuel combustion?
It's not, so oil and gas or oil and coal would be worse than burning wood. Natural gas is a little cleaner than burning wood too, but burning wood is bad. So if you have a fireplace, I actually encourage you to get rid of it. It just adds, I know it's a small amount, but it does add to the problem. As I said, black carbon has a very high warming capacity. It's very bad. And it's bad to breathe in, indoors and outdoors. It's very bad for your lungs.
Okay, and there's a follow-up question. It says, so we'd prefer electric heating, preferably powered by hydro.
Yeah, I know depending on where you live, your electricity may come from different sources. It may come from coal, it may come from nuclear. Out here in the Bay Area, we're fortunate to have renewable energy sources. But yeah, so electric is the best way to go, the cleanest.
Excellent. Okay, so we're gonna have a couple other sections like this where people can ask questions. So if there's any other comments or questions that people have relevant to what we've discussed so far, they can put them in the chat. Otherwise, we will continue on and we'll pause for questions at a later point in the presentation. Go ahead, Tina.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Next slide. So these rising temperatures are causing a disruption of air and water currents. Let me switch to the next slide. It's disrupting the jet stream. A weakening of the jet stream is causing the polar vortex that brings cold Arctic air south while pushing warmer air north, which you can see in the right hand of the slide here. That's what is actually happening right now around the globe, from the Midwest to Northern Europe and Asia, where there are currently sub-zero temperature extremes that are being triggered by this unstable jet stream. Next slide. So ocean currents are also affected and are slowing due to the warming planet. A system of ocean currents in the Atlantic, which influences weather patterns in Europe, North America, and parts of Africa, brings warm water from the tropics to the north and transports cold water back to the south through the deep ocean. The system has slowed down by 15% over the last 50 or so years. Next slide. These currents are expected to continue to slow as the planet warms, adding to the intensity of winter storms and heat waves in Europe, sea level rise on the east coast of the US, and more prolonged drought in the Sahel region of Africa. The Atlantic system is crucial to maintaining relatively stable weather conditions on the planet. Models suggest that a strong weakening of the system would reduce the absorption of CO2 by the ocean, which would increase the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and increase global warming. This is one example of a positive feedback loop. Next slide. So positive feedback loops are a chain of events that accelerate warming. You go to the next slide. For instance, as temperatures rise, ice and permafrost melts, creating more warming and then more melting and so on. Ice reflects the sun rays, whereas water and land are darker surfaces and absorb solar energy, warming the atmosphere even more and leading to more melting. While the melting of both poles adds to warming, the ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica are what will have the greatest impact on sea level rise because they sit on land. The ice in the Arctic is mainly on water, so as it melts, it adds less to sea level rise. Ignore that sound, it's my cats who are really pissed off that I locked them out of this room. We're going to watch a short video now that goes into the Antarctic ice sheets and what's happening right now. Thank you. So that's what will happen if we don't establish socialist revolution and solve this problem. So polar amplification describes that the poles are actually warming twice as fast as the rest of the globe. And this is happening due to the loss of ice that then accelerates the warming. And the slowing ocean currents and shifting air currents also play a factor in this accelerated warming at the poles. Next slide. Another example of a feedback loop triggered by warming is lightning. Rising temperatures are causing atmospheric instability, which is increasing the frequency of lightning strikes. Lightning releases nitrogen oxides, a greenhouse gas, which causes more warming and more atmospheric instability and more lightning. A side effect of the increased lightning is wildfires. And the added heat and lower humidity in the atmosphere caused by increased warming at the same time increases fire risk. Smoke from the fires then further exacerbates warming. Here, the next slide. The California fires that began in August were caused by a prolonged heat wave that clashed with a tropical cyclone off the coast, causing 20,000 lightning strikes over 4 days that ignited over 700 fires. Next slide. In the San Francisco Bay, we had 30 straight days of extremely unhealthy air quality, plus the eerie orange sky day, which was caused by the immense amount of smoke that was trapped above a layer of fog that only let the orange light rays through. Major fires burned throughout the Western states in 2020, with major impacts in the urban centers of Portland and Seattle as well. And every year is getting worse. Next slide. The Arctic Circle is also seeing a big increase in lightning strikes, resulting in wildfires across the region. Lightning strikes in the Arctic have increased from 35,000 to 250,000 in just the last decade, and ignited fires that burned the largest land mass globally over the last 2 years. I want to just reiterate again that there are solutions to these problems, because it may seem pretty bleak right now. Next slide, and any questions on what I just covered in this last section?
So we have a couple questions about sea level rising. The first, or sort of a compound question I'll ask, is sea level rise not uniform? And then there's a follow-up that says, or is it that it impacts the East Coast more because we're lower?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with the tidal conditions. You know, every place is kind of unique of how much the tides increase and decrease at one moment, and storm surge, along with the actual rising sea levels, and warmer waters, because warm water expands more, so warm waters will rise more as well. So there's a little difference, but in general, I mean, once overall, it will, if sea level rises significantly, every place will be impacted around the globe. But, there are a lot of East Coast cities that are lower lying, and yeah, there's especially like the southern part, Florida in particular, is already seeing, they've been having for years now, sunny day flooding, which is just a normal day and the streets are filled with water because of the king tides, but it's more extreme because of sea level rise.
We have one more about the sky in San Francisco with that slide. It says, how did the smoke get trapped above the fog in California?
So, okay, my meteorological education here. So basically the air was, the smoke, here we have, tends to have in the morning a marine layer that comes off the ocean. So it was lower, it was closer to the ground than the smoke was. The smoke was at a higher elevation. So it had that smoke because there were so many fires that were putting out huge amount of smoke. We were getting smoke the whole way from Washington, Oregon coming down, in addition to the fires we had locally. But the smoke was at a much higher elevation than the fog. So the fog layer was below it, and it basically was like a cap, a lid that kept the smoke above it. The next day we woke up to having really, really bad air quality because there wasn't the fog and the mixing had occurred and the smoke was now at ground level. But actually the orange sky day, the air quality wasn't that bad at ground level, ironically, but it looked really scary.
Okay, and we have one more question and I think we can proceed. It says, if it's conceivable that greenhouse gas emissions will continue for some time on an individual or desperate level, what areas would be the most important to prioritize regarding cutting emissions? Military, auto?
I mean, really, the system of production we have, so, you know, traffic is a big issue too. I know here in the Bay Area, traffic is and in California in general, traffic is the largest contributor to CO2 emissions. But yeah, the production system, and yeah, the military is never taken into account at these UN summits, all the pollution from the US military, which is the biggest consumer of fossil fuels on the planet. So yeah, I would say all those things. The imperialist war machine needs to go, and the wasteful production system that is not energy efficient, it's not sustainable, and puts out, I'll talk about this a little bit in the class about capitalism, but you know, there's 100 companies can be linked to 71% of emissions just since 1988. So it's really these, you know, the corporations, this production, you know, that are producing most of this as opposed to individuals.
Excellent. Okay, so I think we can move on now.
Okay, next slide. So we're talking more about the oceans, how the warming oceans and the atmosphere are working. 2020 had so many Atlantic storms that they ran out of letters to name them and moved to the Greek alphabet. There was also a record-long monsoon season in Asia, where Korea had record rainfall and massive flooding from 49 straight days of heavy rain. While we can't say that one storm or another can be attributed specifically to climate change, there is clear evidence that the conditions created by climate change fuel these storms and make them more likely to occur, and more powerful and slower moving, bringing heavier rainfall and flooding. Now we're gonna watch another short video. Can you start that?
Whenever an extreme weather event happens, one of the first questions everyone wants to know is, was this latest hurricane caused by global warming or not? If you asked 100 climate scientists, nearly every one of us would agree that a given hurricane did not occur because of climate change, but it could be exacerbated by it in a few different ways. First, in a warmer world, there's more water vapor available for storms to sweep up and dump on us, and hurricanes are very big storms. We have already seen increases in heavy precipitation around the world as the planet has warmed. This is one of the symptoms of climate change that has been definitely fingerprinted or attributed to human-induced change. It's estimated that almost 40% of the rainfall that fell during Hurricane Harvey would not have occurred if the same hurricane had happened 100 years ago when the world was not as warm as today. Nearly every scientific study agrees that as the world warms, the amount of rainfall associated with hurricanes will increase on average. Second, as the world warms, the seas are rising. As land-based ice melts and warm ocean water expands. This increases the risks associated with storm surges. With more water behind them, they can be more powerful. And with higher sea level, more coastal areas will be flooded during a given storm on average than would have been 50 or 100 years ago. And then we have the fact that hurricanes get their energy from warm ocean water. And over 93% of the extra heat being trapped inside the climate system by this blanket of heat-trapping gases we're wrapping around the Earth, over 93% of that heat is going where? Into the ocean. There's other factors in play, but all else being equal, warmer oceans will increase the energy available to hurricanes, so they can intensify faster as they pass over areas with unusually warm water. That's why it's likely that we will see more intense hurricanes in the future. Not only that, but we now know too that hurricanes are getting bigger and they're also getting slower as the planet warms. So they can cover greater area and they can sit over us for longer and dump more rain on us today than they could before. So how will the number of hurricanes and other tropical cyclones and typhoons change in the future? What we know right now suggests that we might not see any increases in the total number of hurricanes in the future, but the storms we will see will most likely be fiercer ones. Here's the bottom line. Climate change doesn't cause most hurricanes or floods or even wildfires, but it does make them stronger and more devastating. So if we only use our experience with past disasters to inform future preparation, we will be dangerously underestimating coastal flooding, rainfall, and even the average strength of the hurricanes that come our way. To protect ourselves from weather and climate disasters, we need to be looking to the future, not the past. Whenever an extreme weather...
Okay. So ocean CO2 absorption is leading to acidification. The oceans are the largest carbon sink, sequestering more carbon from the atmosphere than all the forests combined. Microscopic phytoplankton work the same way as plants do on land, turning CO2 into oxygen. When they die, the carbon in their bodies is deposited on the ocean floor. But due to the increasing levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, the oceans are becoming oversaturated with CO2, which inhibits exoskeleton formation in shellfish, mollusks, and corals, impacting the marine food chain. Next slide. The warming waters are stressing many species, especially corals, with increasing bleaching events occurring around the globe. You can see the dark red areas are the impacted areas. This was from 2016, which was a particularly devastating year for reefs. It was very high water temperatures. Next slide. Bleaching occurs when there is a sustained spike in water temperatures of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. When this occurs, the symbiotic algae that live in the corals release a toxin and the coral expels the algae. If temperatures drop in a short amount of time, the algae will repopulate the corals and it will recover. If not, the corals die and the reef ecosystem collapses. Next slide. Reefs are important for the health of the marine food chain. 25% of marine species rely on reefs for food or shelter. Reefs supply 70% of protein for island nations, and they protect coasts from storms and sea level rise. The warming oceans are also affecting ocean upwellings that bring nutrient-rich waters from the depths, which is causing ocean deserts that are devoid of life. Next slide, and I believe it's questions, if anyone has any questions from that last section.
Yes, we have a couple. We'll start with this one. It says, are kelp farms considered a good practice for carbon capture and reduction, of course, including a great reduction of CO2 emission?
Yeah, if they're done sustainably, yes. Kelp farms are good. There's actually a project out of Monterey Bay that is building these arrays that basically float in the water just below the surface. So basically like creating kelp farms in the middle of the ocean that would then rise and fall with the wave action and bring those nutrient-rich waters from the depths, as well as bring an abundance of life, be a feeding ground for fish and habitat for fish.
Okay, we have a few more here. This next one says, the hurricane scientist said that climate change doesn't necessarily cause more storms to happen, but we ran out of letters to assign to storms last year because of the number of storms. Is that one more thing. Is that because storms that wouldn't ordinarily have been assigned names are getting them because they are now more powerful in recent years?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I know we are getting way more storms, and that is due to climate change. But yeah, maybe it's the severity of the storms that is triggering the naming of them. Also, that video might have been made before this last hurricane season, which may have changed their perspective on that.
Okay, so we have a lot of great questions here, but we're gonna just answer the ones that are relevant to this section, and I think we'll address a couple of them at the end. So these next two, it says sunscreen in coral reefs. I heard that's a problem.
There are reef-safe sunscreens. I can't remember the name of the chemical, but you can go online and search it. There's a chemical that's normally in sunscreens that's what kills, is detrimental to the coral and the fish. But so you can purchase reef-safe. It's becoming more and more available.
Excellent. Okay, and then someone is asking, can we hear more about Cuba's ocean coral restoration programs?
You know, I'll talk about that in the next class some more, but yeah, they are doing a lot of work. I actually had the privilege to visit their coral nursery. It's on the eastern tip of the island. They're basically growing coral in these structures underwater, and then they go and plant it back on the reef. And their issue right now is because the hurricanes are getting more severe, they're smashing into the reef and destroying the reef, right? So after hurricanes, they're regrowing coral and putting it back on the reef. Cuba is notorious for having really amazing conservation programs, and they always have. Fidel loved Jacques Cousteau. I went diving with him, so he always had a love for the reef. So there was a lot of effort put early on into protecting the reef there.
Excellent. Okay. So I think those are all the questions for this section. Again, we'll have another opportunity to ask questions later on in the presentation.
Okay. So industrial agriculture exacerbates climate change. You can go to the next slide, actually. Ocean dead zones occur annually from agricultural runoff. The nitrogen and phosphorus in industrial fertilizers cause algae blooms in oceans and bays. And as these massive algae blooms die, they absorb all the oxygen in the water, and all other life in the immediate area dies. That's why there are mass fish die-offs in Florida and the Gulf Coast. These dead zones could be largely eliminated by shifting to regenerative agriculture practices that eliminate the need for fertilizers and increase water and soil retention so that the soil nutrients aren't washed in the waterways. Next slide. Another way that industrial agriculture exacerbates climate change is through the release of carbon into the atmosphere. Plowing fields releases stored carbon in the soil and increases water loss. GMOs, pesticides, and other chemicals that are sprayed on the fields kill the soil microbiome. A healthy microbiome transforms the plant matter containing carbon that the plants have pulled from the atmosphere and stores it in the soil. The chemicals also poison groundwater, the food, and farm workers. Industrial livestock feedlots release large amounts of methane into the atmosphere from the massive pools that collect animal waste, plus the poor quality feed that is harder for the animals to digest. I'll talk more about the regenerative agriculture and managed grazing of livestock as a solution in the next class, and talk about how basically it can do the opposite and can capture and retain carbon in the soil. Next slide. Stressed ecosystems are triggering the sixth mass extinction. An ecosystem is like a factory, with each species acting as a cog in a wheel, keeping the factory producing. When a species or a cog in the wheel is lost, the system falters and is stressed. When too many cogs are lost, the factory stops producing, causing ecosystem collapse. We are currently in the midst of the sixth mass extinction. Next slide. But species can be very resilient and can recover from the brink of extinction, like the humpback and gray whales have in the last few decades, as well as tigers in Siberia. Supercorals are emerging in the Great Barrier Reef that can withstand bleaching events. And simple things like the creation of wildlife bridges and underpasses around the globe are supporting an increase in numbers of previously dwindling species. Next slide. COVID is a result of climate change. More viruses like COVID will arise due to stressed ecosystems that result from the warming climate and human encroachment on wildlands. Stressed ecosystems cause new diseases to arise in animal populations, and human encroachment into wildlands puts those animals into closer contact with humans, creating a pathway for the viruses to spread to humans. The rise of Lyme disease is thought to be linked to deforestation. And as the planet warms, diseases that were only seen in the tropics, like dengue and malaria, will spread to traditionally temperate regions of the globe. Next slide. I want to end by stressing the urgency for comprehensive action on climate change. In 2018, the UN IPCC warned that we have 12 years to greatly reduce emissions to avert catastrophe. Despite the fact that there is hope for solving the crisis, despite that effective solutions are being implemented around the globe at the local level, much more comprehensive and aggressive action is needed to avoid a runaway scenario where the warming will exceed the capacity to mitigate. The time for piecemeal reforms has long passed. We must drastically curb global emissions immediately, especially in the wealthier countries that have a greater per capita carbon footprint. And at the same time, we must restore and protect ecosystems that pull carbon from the atmosphere that's already been emitted. This is what can save humanity, but it will take a globally coordinated effort, and capitalism and imperialist policies stand in the way of achieving that goal. I'll go into more on this in the upcoming classes, so I hope you can all join those. And now I think we're gonna ask the audience to answer a few questions, just sort of, knowledge retainment.
We have a few, sorry, before we get to this section, we have a few questions, I think, from the last section you went over. Do we want to go those first?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, there's a few here. It says, would you consider permaculture? Would you consider permaculture practices such as hog culture, sustainable alternatives to agriculture as it's done by big agribusiness?
I'm not familiar with hog culture. But yeah, permaculture tends to be similar to regenerative agriculture, intercropping, not using pesticides, not using herbicides, just using, planting things together to ward off pests, things like that. And I believe it also, I'm not sure about the plowing, if permaculture incorporates that, but I'll talk more about, the how we should be growing our food in the next class.
Okay, there's one that says, how do GMOs kill the microbes in the soil? It says that seems like a bad trait to engineer.
Well, a lot of these seeds, these GMO seeds have pesticides embedded in them, like they've somehow engineered them to be part of the seed itself. So, that gets in the soil, and the herbicides, the herbicides that are in the seeds too. And Roundup is a big problem. It's actually not only killing the microbiome in the soil, but then it's killing the microbiome in our stomachs when we eat that food that has it on it, which is, some people are saying that's another reason, like why all these allergies and rare diseases are coming up in children right now, and, way more than there ever were, and autism and all these things because of so many, the chemicals that have basically thrown off our internal system. Yeah, hopefully that answers it.
Excellent. Okay, so we have a couple more questions about HABs. One is, do you think HABs or harmful algal blooms increase COVID risk?
Whether algal blooms cover it? Well, I don't know what that connection would be. From the dead zones I was talking about. I assume that's what you mean.
I believe so. You can clarify in the chat if you'd like, the person who asked that question. There's one more. It says, how are red tides or HABs exacerbated by climate change, and how exactly do these do? And what exactly do these do? Sorry.
Yeah. So, like I was saying, the algae blooms often. Some of the algae blooms are related to other things like the warmer water temperatures that are happening with climate change, but the ones that are happening at like the mouths of rivers and coastal areas where there's a lot of agriculture, that's directly linked to the runoff from the fields. So all the fertilizers, the chemical fertilizers that are put in the fields that have high phosphorus and nitrogen. But there are some other, we had some algae blooms in Monterey Bay last year, and they were linked to the warming temperatures.
Excellent. Okay, I think those are the only ones that I see here. So I think we can move to these questions that we have on the slides.
You want to go to the next slide, Esteban?
Okay, so this question is, how does a positive feedback loop work? What we can do here, we want you guys to answer this question, so you can either drop your response in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, I see we says drives a system in one direction. Another says it's a self-fulfilling cycle. The results make the start worse. It's also reinforcing. Continue to comment, says the effect exacerbates the cause.
Yeah, so each step of the way is building on adding more warming. Basically, it's a chain reaction.
Excellent.
Yep.
Do we want to go to the next one? I think we have a few more responses I can read.
Okay.
It says the effects of man-made climate change trigger processes in the natural environment that then further aggravate climate change, even without human contribution.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Do we want to proceed to the next slide?
Yeah, I think so.
Excellent. So this question says, what are some ways that climate change is affecting the planet? Okay, sea level rise, glacier melting, ocean acidification, more intensity of severe weather events, stronger storms, changing currents. All right, you guys are paying attention. Droughts, more lights, more wildfires, and warming. There's quite a few answers here. I'm gonna pull this chat up just so I can read them a little bit more easily. Slower hurricanes that carry more rain, more lightning strikes. See, droughts in the valley, warming waters, which are affecting the reefs, impacting storms and glaciers, diseases. Okay. Change in animal and plant distribution, mass extinctions, more pandemics in the futures, killing off marine life, migration. Okay. Harms to ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm not seeing anything that hasn't already been stated. Land erosion, dead nutrientless soil. Disruption of food chains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are all correct.
Okay, let's move to this next question. Okay, it says, what is climate change? Sorry, that's not what it says. It says, how is climate change impacting your community? This is a good time for people to think about what they've observed locally and how it's connected to the climate crisis. Okay, we're getting a few answers here. This first one says causing anxiety. Another one says the polar vortex here in Chicago right now. People displaced by wildfires, more wildfires. People are experiencing a lot of fires. Okay, there's more. It says more intense hurricanes. Another person says, where I live, our wells have dried so that we have to order water refills.
Hmm.
People who live near the beach experience more flooding than storms. Bad air from raging fires. Okay, we're not getting enough fruits and vegetables. Increased severity of chronic physical issues and mental health disorders. Also protective food planes. It says Denver has some of the worst air quality in the world for a few days last summer because of the wildfires. Droughts. The Rio Grande River is drying at alarming rates. Winter storms due to Lake Erie. Dakota Access Pipeline spilled on friends at the Standing Rock Reservation. Toxic groundwater in the Bay Area, particularly in areas. Okay, there's quite a few here. Let me adjust this. Okay, COVID, there's a lot, there's so many. Michigan coasts are disappearing. Colorado River, tropical diseases. Okay, expensive food. Should we continue?
If you see any different ones, otherwise, yeah, I think that.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of similar ones.
And that's good to hear that. I mean, it's not good to hear that you're having impacts, but.
That people are aware. There's one that says difficulty breathing. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, in general, the higher temperatures are causing poor air quality in a lot of regions.
Okay. Now, 1 second here.
So yeah, I think we can open up for just general questions and discussion.
Okay, there are a few questions that we have from earlier on. One of them says, can you talk about greenhouse gas co-pollutants in low-income AB 617 communities and how socialism can end facility clustering in disadvantaged communities?
That's a California question because I know AB 617 from my job. Yeah, so we're statewide, California has implemented funding to address basically environmental racism. You know, the impacts, the uneven impacts, the unequal impacts of air pollution that poor communities and poor communities of color are affected by. Yeah, I know from working in the Bay Area, you know, some of these neighborhoods like West Oakland has the highest asthma rate in, I don't know, maybe the state or the country. And it's a largely African-American population. And they deal with, yeah, not only the effects of climate change, but they're right by the Port of Oakland, which has lots of diesel trucks, the emissions from the shipping. They have trucks going through their neighborhoods. They have industry in their neighborhood. So all these things exacerbate the pollution problem. And I know with smog build, they also are surrounded by a lot of freeways. And I know with the smog buildup, the more pollution, general pollution you have, the more likelihood for that smog is to build up when the temperatures are higher. So yeah, the environmental racism is a real thing. And just like the effects of climate change, the poor of the world and the poor of this country will be affected most. And yeah, that's why we need socialism.
Okay.
Because, you know, Biden has this climate plan that he's going to address environmental racism. I'm very skeptical.
Okay, we have one here. It says, in reference to solar panels and wind turbines, how would socialism mitigate the pollution and destruction from the extraction of minerals necessary for these solutions? And I know that we have a class later on that might discuss this, but if you wanted to.
Yeah, I'll talk about it again next time, but yeah, that is a real concern. I'm not a big fan of the film Planet of Humans that was produced by Michael Moore, but it did point out the problem of, partly a critique of the disorganized way and the really not really sufficient way that the US is going about with renewables. But there is the concern that, if we try to produce all the energy we're currently consuming and just build, wind, water, and solar to produce that energy, that what it takes to extract the minerals for the solar panels, and the carbon that it takes to build all those wind turbines and all those things will not it'll take so much carbon to build it that it won't offset enough in the end, which is why we need major energy reductions and energy efficiency. And really that can only happen in a socialist plan economy. Like I'll talk about next week, I'll go into how Cuba had an energy revolution where they distributed energy efficient appliances to 100% of the homes in Cuba and really brought down their energy consumption. That's what we need to do here. I mean, but reorganize society so we're using less energy, because that is true. It will be a problem to just shift to renewables without reducing our energy consumption.
Okay, so I'm seeing some other questions come in, and people can continue to kind of drop them in if they want to get maybe their inquiries responded to. We have one here that says, is there a way to remove methane from the atmosphere in a way that trees and plants remove carbon?
I don't know a way that there is, actually. I think we need to greatly reduce. I mean, methane is only a small portion of the CO2 is by far the largest GHG emissions that we have. Methane is a much smaller part. But for instance, I believe there's 3 million leaking abandoned oil and gas wells around the US that these companies, big oil has just abandoned them and left them leaking. And that's spewing tons of methane into the atmosphere every day. So we could cap all those wells. That would be number one to do. Yeah, I don't know of any way to extract it from the atmosphere. But the good news is it only lasts for, I think it's only in the atmosphere for 12 years.
Okay, there's one question that says, can you briefly talk about tar sands and its effect on the environment?
Tar sands are, I don't know if you all have seen pictures of what the extraction looks like, but it's these, I mean, it basically turns these ecosystems, they look like the surface of the moon. I mean, just completely just devastates the ecosystem. It's basically extracting this dirty crude from sand. And it's up in Canada in these pristine boreal forests on indigenous land, and it's polluting the water, it's polluting the air, it's causing cancer in these indigenous communities. Yeah, it's very, very destructive. It's considered an extreme fossil fuel. That along with fracking, I mean, it's just like big oil is just grasping for the last resources that they can sell off. But yeah, it's very, very bad. And then transporting it through these pipelines like Keystone XL and Dakota Access there's always leaks along the way that poison the water along the way to wherever it's being transported for refinement. So it's very, very bad.
Okay, so we have quite a few questions coming in now. So what I want to actually do, because I know that we're going to be going over some of the content that these questions are asking about in the later classes, perhaps I can just read them and you let me know if you want to answer it now or get into it later. I think there's sufficient to actually, there's enough, I think, to do that. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great. So let's go with, can you touch on the overproduction of dairy under capitalism, such as the Tulare County? Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that county, but yeah, I mean, just like really meat and dairy consumption in the US is way too high. It's not healthy for us to eat that much, and it's not, sustainable to produce that much. Yeah, big dairy, I mean, it's it's harmful. It's not a sustainable practice. We need all the industrial agriculture and livestock raising and dairy and needs to shift. But I'm not familiar with that county. I can look into it more. But.
The next one is, are the animal and plant agriculture industry vastly different in terms of causing climate change or largely similar in impact?
Yeah, I mean, one is releasing, the plant agriculture is releasing, poisoning water and using up water resources and releasing carbon into the atmosphere, whereas the animal and livestock production methane is probably the biggest problem with that. I would say they're both bad. I don't know, if you need to rate them one over the other, but one thing I'm going to talk about in the next class as well, so much, I don't know the number, but I will have it next week. A huge portion of the industrial agriculture land in this country is used to grow feed for livestock. It's used for corn and soybean production, not for humans, for feed for these giant feedlots. And lots of the meat we produce is exported. It's not even used here. It's not even eaten by people here. And like I said, we need to greatly reduce our intake. So yeah, in that sense, like we're growing way too much of this corn and soy and devastating the land and releasing all this carbon in the atmosphere. They're very much linked and very bad.
Okay. So this next one is it possible to do GMO crops at an industrial scale in a sustainable way?
There's always been like, engineering crops to some level in the, like always, you're splicing different seeds, different plants together to make a hybrid, like get an edible apple that tastes good. I mean, people have been doing that for probably thousands of years. But the problem with the GMOs now is first of all, it's used as a tool of capitalism to control farmers and to control the market and to make profits because they're locked into using only these seeds. And studies have shown that these seeds cause problems, cause tumors in rats and things, and it's not good for human health. So I would say GMOs in the sense of like Monsanto GMOs, no, it's not sustainable. It's not needed. We don't need GMOs. It's a myth that we can't feed the world without them. That is pure propaganda. The only reason there's food shortages in this world is because of distribution. It's not because the land cannot produce the crops. It's how it's being produced is the problem, and distribution.
This next question is, under socialism, how would we address chronic water shortage pollution in places where water is scarce, like in the Southwest of the United States or other desert areas?
Yeah, so reforestation, I know it's a dry, arid area, but there have been studies and projects around the globe that have actually, have greened the desert. And by planting trees, it's basically the trees pull up water that's deeper in the ground that can't be accessed otherwise. And it just over a very short period of time can change the soil makeup, can change the water retention of the soil. There are farmers in the Sahel region of Africa that, started using, planting trees with their crops, and just in a few short years, the water table changed drastically and for the good. Really, we can undo desertification with plants and trees.
Okay, this next one says, how do you confront the idea that some people have where they think global warming will eventually be solved by Silicon Valley without the need for radical change?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I have a coworker. I mean, I work in air quality. I have a coworker who worships Elon Musk and thinks like his electric vehicles and his all his projects are going to save us. It's really, I mean, tech solutions are not going to save us. Geoengineering, like Bill Gates wants to seed the atmosphere to cool air temperatures. I mean, these ideas are, first of all, extremely dangerous and really in the end like aren't going to solve the problem, because it's just about producing more stuff that really isn't going to solve it. We need to produce less stuff and help the ecosystem recover. That's how we'll survive. I'll talk about this more in the class about capitalism too. But yeah, I mean, the idea of building these machines to capture carbon from the atmosphere have been shown to it would take more carbon to build those machines and run them than it would pulling from the atmosphere. So it's really just a distraction. It's propaganda. It's, the ruling class wants us to worship these, tech gurus and just sit back and wait for them to save us, as opposed to taking action ourselves and demanding that real action is taken.
Excellent. So it says here, how do we combat the myth of that overpopulation is causing climate change?
I'll also talk about this in the third class, but can touch on it now. First of all, under a socialist system where resources were evenly distributed and society was run and production was sustainable, there could actually be larger population on the planet and we'd be fine. Like, the planet has the capacity to support more humans, but not with capitalism, because capitalism is so unsustainable and we're using up so many resources, not we necessarily as individuals, but the system itself is using up so many resources. And there's also, lots of studies have shown if you give young women education, economic opportunities, and family planning resources, birth control, things like that, the numbers go way down of children being born. So those two things together, keeping those in mind. It's overpopulation itself is not going to be our demise. It's the system that uses too many resources. That's the problem.
Okay. This next one says, won't the melting of polar ice caps release huge amounts of methane?
That's the permafrost. That's in the Arctic. It's actually on land and underwater. And yes, it's, there's these sinkholes that are happening all across Siberia that are, basically like trapped methane underground, that as the permafrost melts, it releases this gas into the atmosphere. That is a very dangerous runaway scenario. I talk about this in the book. I'm not sure if I'll talk about it next time again, but there's this project happening in Siberia. It's this, they've discovered that bringing back these grazing herds of animals can actually help keep the permafrost cooler because of their grazing, which is interesting because the animals dig the snow away, and by exposing the earth to the air, it actually keeps it cooler, which seems counterproductive or counter to what you would think. But so it's this big project. They're getting all these herds of bison, all these large grazing animals from around the world to populate this region to cool the climate and to keep the permafrost intact. So there's little ways like that that can happen. But, like I said, if we reforested the planet, it shows that it can draw 2/3 of the carbon from the atmosphere, which would cool the planet in, just a couple decades. So if we act quickly, we could stop this melting permafrost too.
Okay. This next question is, will the loss of ocean currents cause loss of reliable climates for agriculture?
Yeah, it can cause droughts in certain regions, and then, you know, wetter conditions in other regions. So, and very cold temperatures. You know, I was reading, I can't remember what part of the world it was, but there was, you know, one part of the world has been getting hit by really cold spells, unusual cold spells during their growing season. And so there's actually been food shortages because it's colder, which is ironic because the planet itself is warming. But like I said, the way the ocean currents work, it warms some areas and cools others. So yeah, and as that shifts, it will shift the growing seasons.
Excellent. So there's one that says, can you talk about coal ash ponds?
I'm not an expert on coal ash ponds, but I mean, anything where any of these, you know, toxic, you know, same with the tar sands, I think, and fracking, there's all this like wastewater that comes from it, and the coal ash too, that's kept in these ponds that inevitably always leak. Same as you know, when there was these big storms in North Carolina, I think it was the year prior, 2018 maybe, or early 2019, you know, the flooding, like all these big pools, because there's a lot of hog production there, and these big pools of animal waste, like just got washed away into the groundwater and drinking water, and just like made everything, it's not good. We need to stop making toxic pools from industry. It's never a good thing, and it always ends up leaking, and the industries are never held accountable.
Okay, did I mute myself? No, I did not mute myself. All right, this question is, earlier you touched on the US military, and I was curious how much the relentless nuclear weapons testing has affected climate. Has it done so permanently?
I'm not sure how radiation, I mean, you know, the carbon that's produced, there's definitely carbon that's produced from any of these bombs that they're using, radioactive or not. I mean, the radiation definitely hurts ecosystems, it hurts humans. Although, like, if you look at Chernobyl right now, and there's this like amazing ecosystem that's emerged, like wolves and deer and all these animals have come back and are living in this radioactive place. So there's also signs that like life can thrive despite, humans can't, but other species can thrive in radioactive conditions. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, the radiation doesn't necessarily affect the atmospheric warming, I don't think, not directly.
Okay, so this last question here says, Americans use more per person than every other nation. They say, I think it's as much as 2 to the next country, or twice as much as the next country. Do we see lifestyle changes as a portion of our future plan?
Absolutely. But part of it is really systemic, you know, it's systemic. It's like we're all forced to, you know, I'm a renter. I live in this old, uninsulated apartment with leaky windows, and I'm constantly having to crank my heat because it just goes outside, you know. And, you know, most people can't afford electric vehicles. Most people have to live far out from where they work and have to drive because, you know, it's not affordable to live in cities where they work. So yeah, there will need to be lifestyle changes in that sense, but it's really a systemic shift. I mean, I'm sure everyone would much rather be able to like walk to their job than have to sit in their car for an hour or 2 to get to work. So yeah, I mean, energy efficiency, consuming less, but most of the U.S. working class is not the problem. It's I wrote an article a few months ago. There was a UN climate report that came out. I'm going to touch on this in one of the other classes too. So apologies if you join all the classes, you're going to hear this a few times. But it was a UN emissions report, and called out the 1% as being the problem for the majority of the pollution, the emissions that are causing climate change, because they consume so many resources. They have multiple cars, they have giant houses that use up energy. They buy and throw away things constantly. Whereas, the working class of the US is just struggling paycheck to paycheck is not the problem. But yeah, but the working class should have an easier life by living and working in close proximity, and that would be beneficial. And having, the system of protection would shift, where we make things to last instead of these throwaway items and things that are made to break. So you have to replace them every year or two. So yeah, in that sense, things lifestyle would shift.
Okay, so this class is set to go for about an hour and a half, but I think we have time for one more question. And it is there serious risk of an ice age sickness being released from the melting ice, along with warming spreading the breadth of tropical latitudes? Would melting ice up the frequency of new sicknesses?
I mean, they are finding anthrax and things like that being there'll be things that the land's melting, and there'll be a carcass of a dead animal that have been frozen for thousands of years in it. But there's not many people living up there, so I don't see it being a huge risk of transmitting to the general population. But who knows? I mean, it's really a big unknown of what's going to happen. But yeah, like I said, with COVID and malaria and dengue and things like that, Zika, these things, there'll be new diseases that come, and as ecosystems are stressed by the climate, if we don't stop it.
Can't forget that part.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's about all the time that we have for this class today. Thank you all the comrades for joining. Again, please continue to join us for the upcoming classes. Next Sunday, February 14th at 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, we'll be having class 2 titled Real Solutions to the Crisis. And again, every Sunday in February at the same time, we will have a class of this series. Lastly, I want to remind people that you can purchase the book online. I'm going to put the link in the chat right now. Again, it is not required to read the book to attend the class, but we do highly recommend it. And that's about it. Thank you again, Tina, and thank you everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.